Hello, everyone out there. Welcome back to the Extra Milestone, your monthly-ish Cinemaholic spin-off series where we go back in time to talk about the classic films that have made the cinematic landscape what it is today. I am your host, as always, Sam Noland, and with me I have one of my dearest friends on this green and blue earth, the head writer of Cinemaholics and just all around hip and happening voice in the discourse of cinema. It is none other than John Negroni. John, how are you?
Sam Nolan, don't you dare podcast with anybody else. P.S. I think I'll be home all day. X.
I don't know what any of that was even remotely about, but you know what? I'm here for it.
It's from Seven Chances, the movie we're talking about.
Yeah, I do that. Oh, it makes sense now.
That's the note that. Well, I would have just passed you a note. It would have made even more sense, but
yes, it helps that this is not a silent podcast. As often as I've wanted to try and experiment with that, I don't think the title cards would work particularly well. Don't wow at me condescendingly, John. I know you've thought about it as well.
Yeah, it's whenever I'm invited. It's like, oh, I wish this was a silent podcast and John wouldn't talk. I get it.
That's not exactly what I said, but it's pretty close, so I'll take it.
Pretty close.
Regardless, we're going to move right on past that. Yes, this is going to be a little bit of a different episode of the Extra Milestone. We had announced on our most recent main episode of the show, in which Will Ashton, as well as myself, and you, John, you were there too. We talked about Pinocchio. Remember that? That was a fun time.
I'd fib, but my nose would hit the microphone.
Yes, it was something along those lines. And we had announced at the end of that show that we were going to start doing a little bit of an expansion of the Extra Milestone. And the way we would be doing that was we would be doing a little bit of shorter episodes in between the big, long, detailed dives into these movies that you and Will and I do on a monthly-ish basis. And I'd announced that the first one was going to be myself and Adonis Gonzalez. We were going to talk about The Grapes of Wrath and Terror of Mechagodzilla. And we had a variety of scheduling conflicts, and that did not ultimately pan out in time for this release date I was hoping for. So, John, the courageous, heroic gentleman that you are, you offered to do a little, just a little filler with me, and so I think that was a good idea, and that's I'm standing by it.
It's just you're just like, well, I have to do this podcast with somebody by 7:00 with just some hosts. Oh, I'm not saying. Oh, it's just like I have to, and it could just be anyone. Really, is what you're telling me right now.
Yeah,
storm off.
John is just waiting in the wings at any moment to bring up a cheeky reference to the movie we talked about. So it's good to know.
You gave me a list of movies, and as soon as I saw Seven Chances, I knew, all right, if we're going to do this thing kind of on the fly, it might as well be something that is ripe for conversation. First of all, first silent film we've done on Extra Milestone, which a little embarrassing when you think about it. We've been doing this for about a year.
Yeah.
And it took until now to do one of the most iconic, film eras, the one that started it all. A little sad.
Yeah. Cinema has been around for roughly 120 years, a little bit longer if you want to get technical about it, but roughly 120 years. About 30 of those were all silent. Like before sound came in, it took about 30 years for that to happen. So that's a quarter of film history that we've kind of overlooked thus far. And that's not for a lack of trying. We've had multiple silent films on polls over the months.
Yeah.
And I imagine this will be the first of many, especially now that we're expanding it to include less what's the word I'm looking for? Less iconic titles, maybe
Sure.
a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more perhaps I don't want to use the word alien, but just not quite as familiar to the general public
We
as
shouldn't we shouldn't yeah, we shouldn't sugarcoat it, Sam. Like,
yeah,
our listeners, a lot of them, they're probably not that into silent films. They probably haven't seen that many. And,
yes,
I don't wanna make them feel bad for that because, like, I get it. Silent
hmm
films are a hard medium to get used to when you grow up on sound and color, and it is a bit of a leap. However, I want to invite the listeners who are newcomers to silent film or relatively inexperienced to give this a shot, because I think that there is so much value to be gained from this chapter in film history. And I think a lot of people who maybe turn their noses to films like this because they're just assume that
yes,
they wouldn't get anything out of it. Oh, it's too old, it's too old fashioned. They, in my opinion, are really missing out.
yes,
And I just say give it a shot. I get it. It's not Charlie Chaplin we're getting into, which I think is most people's introduction to silent film. However, we
yeah.
are getting into one of the absolute greats. So please stay on this dial.
Yeah, yeah. Buster Keaton is, and this is not meant as a diminishing description to either of these gentlemen, but he's kind of the other Charlie Chaplin that people talk about. It's always those are the big two, and I think it's important that you bring up how silent cinema is not exactly in everyone's wheelhouse, at least not necessarily. And I think a lot of that, a lot of when it comes to trying to introduce the silent era to someone, a lot of it comes down to where do you start? There are a lot of places not to start when it comes to silent cinema. For instance, Man with a Movie Camera is not the movie to dive into silent cinema with. That's incredibly abstract, incredibly based in theory. It is just not the thing to get you jazzed about what else the art form has to hold. However, the silent comedies, I think, are kind of the way to go. It's the way that I
I
was
agree.
introduced to silent cinema, and of course, because they're broadly entertaining, they're mostly visual. A lot of them don't really have to do with the plot, and I think Seven Chances certainly applies.
Yeah. A lot of
It's
them are under an hour.
Yeah, this one is 57 minutes. And I know because I just finished watching it, not 30 minutes before we started recording this podcast. I finished seven chances, so that gives you an idea of how on the fly this is going to be. And for one, I should say I'm really excited about it. So,
I am too.
yeah, John, what say we talk about Buster Keaton's Seven Chances?
And you know what? We should start with saying that you didn't say it enough, I think. Buster Keaton was a total genius. If you are
Yes.
unaware of his filmmaking career, he was, I think Roger Ebert said that is probably the greatest actor director who ever lived. Orson Welles called him the greatest of clowns.
Yep.
Orson Welles, in particular, was really inspired by Buster Keaton in the same way that he acted in a lot of his films and did some of his own stunts. Buster Keaton not only did his stunts, he did a lot of other people's stunts. When you watch a Keaton film, it's undeniable, especially if you're watching it after, if you're a little bit older, if you've gone through many other films, you see, oh my word, everyone under the sun rips this guy off, from Wes Anderson to Tarantino to just everybody who plays around with visual jokes where the camera is the only thing the characters see and puts them on the same level as the audience. That kind of visual comedy was more or less invented by Buster Keaton through his feature films, through his shorts. And yeah, if you want to start with silent films, you just look at any of the films that Keaton made between 1920 and then I want to say like 1929. I think that
Yeah.
was like the last year before he signed with MGM. And he
Yeah.
only did like one more really good film after that, and then his career kind of plateaued from there.
Yeah, it didn't necessarily take a huge dive, but that was really the 20s were the heyday of Buster Keaton.
Yes.
And even going a little bit further back into like the late 1910s, he has some really fantastic shorts, many of them produced in collaboration with
Right.
Comedian Roscoe Arbuckle, who had
Yeah.
a hand in the production of this film as well. And yeah, Buster Keaton was really was for one thing is most iconic for having what is often called the great stone face in comedy. His secret talent was being able to undergo any sort of just utterly bizarre situation and appear to be not phased by it whatsoever, and yet his actions are reacting to it. But he's not
Yeah.
making any sort of wacky faces. He's not gestating particularly much, even though he's moving a lot. It makes it 10 times funnier, and that's why whenever I think of uh, who some of the funniest movie stars are, Buster Keaton comes up first because Buster Keaton does not have to do anything to be funny. That's the magic of this face that this guy has. He just has to sit in a chair and he could just quickly like dart his eyes around the room. And I'm dying laughing. As I was rewatching this movie, I had forgotten so many of the specific jokes that made me laugh the first time, and getting to relive them once again was utterly delightful. And so I was
Yeah.
glad to be. And this is true for literally any of his movies. Like there are ones that I like more than others, obviously, but I cannot think of a single one that is not at least worthwhile in some way or another.
I think this one's special because it's right in the middle of, I think, his auteur decade, because it really was in the 1920s that he was doing his own films. He was working with the same crew, and he was doing bigger and better stunts. I wish we had more time. Like, we could talk about The General and Go West and
Yep.
Our Hospitality and all of these films that really mark a lot of Buster Keaton's different strengths. I think
Yep.
Steamboat Bill Jr. is where a lot of people might recognize some of the infamous house shot, which I think is probably his, like, I don't know. Do you want to say that's his most iconic? Um,
There are a few things that are most iconic. I think that's certainly the one that took hold the most when it came to
yeah,
inspiring others. If you've ever seen a shot, this is what we're referring to. If you've ever seen a shot where like a building or the wall of a building or just some sort of structure looks like it's about to fall on someone, but because of the way a window or an opening on that wall is very specifically placed, they're completely unharmed. That comes
yeah,
from Buster Keaton. That comes from the movie
that's
Steamboat
him.
Bill Jr. There's this big hurricane, and the wall of a house falls down, but Buster Keaton's completely unharmed because he's standing right where the
And they
window
did
was.
that one shot, didn't rehearse it. They
Yep.
just went for it. He had pure confidence in his ability to make that scene work. And so
Yeah.
they didn't even plan to do another shot of it. And like, I think what's great about Buster Keaton in general, and from Seven Chances onward, is like these films are like the precursor to the indie comedy as we know it. These
Mm.
like comedies that are built on really small budgets, and they
Yeah.
still work. And one of the reasons, like, it is amazing how they were able to shoot some of these scenes. Like, there's a scene in The General where a train just like collapses into it. When
Oh
you look at the
gosh.
budget for that movie, and it's like, how did they put the reason they were able to pull these things off is because they didn't have to pay for extra stuntmen. They didn't, like, if a scene went wrong, especially in Seven Chances, if they did something and like, if he misses or if he like gets hurt or whatever, they keep going, and or
Yeah.
they include that into the plot, and including the famous boulder scene. So improv comedy as we know it is like also really benefited by Buster Keaton's work and his contribution to cinema.
Yeah. And one thing I want to make very clear is that this was not without consequence. Buster Keaton's insane skills as a stuntman, it did not always go perfectly right. They did a lot of the times, and that's the thing that's so fascinating about it. But Buster Keaton sustained a lot of injuries on the set of movies. Case in point, on the set of Sherlock Jr., which I would argue is possibly his most iconic movie. That's the one where he literally steps out of a movie screen, and that was the first time that kind of cinematic
Yeah.
self-awareness was done. But there's a scene earlier in the movie where Buster Keaton is hanging onto, and I forget the exact name of this device, but it's like a big silo that pumps water into a train car as it drives by. He was hanging from that spout, and the water was going to come out and just sort of lightly spray him, and he was going to fall to the ground. Apparently, the water came out way harder than they thought it would, like at a much greater force, and it just pummeled him to the ground. And of course, there was a train track below because that's where the train goes. And Buster Keaton landed on that in such a way that he broke his neck.
Yeah.
And they
Oh my
kept
word.
that in the movie. You can actually see it happen. And as a result of that, he sustained migraine headaches for the rest of his life that he had never had before. And That's if you've ever had one, you know how miserable it is. And the funny thing is that he didn't even know that it was broken until years later. Like he was able to shrug it off in just such a way that like scar tissue formed around it. And years later, a doctor said, "Buster, your neck is broken," and it has been for some time now. And just that kind of devotion, I don't condone it. Like like specifically or anything like that, but it just shows how committed he was to being the best of the best, essentially. And he really kind of was when it
Yeah,
came to this very specific kind of comedy. And I
yeah.
think Seven Chances is a really good showing of that, which is funny because as I was doing some very quick bits of research in preparation for this, I found out that Buster was not especially gung ho about this movie, which is
No,
very
he
interesting.
he was actually tricked into doing this movie. So you may know that. So his real name is Joseph Frank Keaton, and you
Yes.
might have heard of his often producer Joseph M. Schenck. They were both married to the Talmadge sisters, and so that was kind of they were in laws. And Shank was a little, if I'm recalling the story correctly, Shank was a little mad with Keaton because he had spent something like $25,000 on a certain scene,
Yep.
and so as a form of implied revenge, he acquired the rights to a very like whatever mediocre stage play from a
Yeah.
decade prior. I forget the name of the stage play, but it's essentially the
Oh gosh,
basis for this movie.
I
And
have it right here.
somehow Buster Keaton turned this situation into one of his best comedies. I mean, it's as Orson Welles would put it, right? One of those happy accidents of filmmaking because it
Yeah.
actually worked out pretty well. But I will say it's based on the stage play to some extent. It's also based on a couple of short films that has sort of this same premise of somebody trying to get married before a deadline. It's
Yeah.
not a super original concept, but obviously they made it their own.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to lay out the basic plot line for anyone who maybe hasn't seen this movie or it's been a while, what happens is that Buster Keaton is along with his partner, whose character's name I can't remember offhand, but they are stockbrokers and they're in a firm together. And
Yeah, so the name of the firm is Meakin and Shannon. His
Meekin
partner
and
is
Shannon.
Billy Meakin. Yeah,
Yeah.
played by T. Roy Barnes.
Yeah, not too shabby there,
Yeah,
and
Thomas.
they've gotten themselves in a bit of debt, and they're not quite sure how to pay it off. But lo and behold, uh, Shannon, Buster Keaton's character, has just inherited $7 million from some sort of deceased relative. But for whatever reason, under the stipulation that he get married by 7 o'clock on his 27th birthday. So I guess this relative just had a thing for the number seven.
Right,
And
exactly. Which, by the
what?
way, the $7 million in 1925, I
Oh
think,
yeah,
would be over $100 million by today's
yeah,
standards. So,
yeah.
quite a bit of a sum.
Yeah, it was funny. As I was rewatching this, they play coy about the actual amount for a little while, and for a moment, I was thinking that they were going to do something actually really clever by sort of hiding the amount because they knew obviously that money wouldn't have the same value forever. So I thought they were not going to specify the amount, and it would just be shown by their reaction. But then when 7 million came on screen on the inner title, I think I did like a double or maybe a triple
Yeah,
take
yeah.
because that's really ludicrous to think about. This is back at the time when admission to the movies was like a nickel. So imagine how much $7 million is. And I think it's really effective the way they do that. But what happens is that Buster Keaton, who just so happens to be in love with this woman, just
Yeah, Mary. He has to marry Mary. And by the
yeah,
way, opening montage, just wonderful.
yeah.
One of my favorite openings to a silent film. But we didn't really get into this before. But did you watch the color version of this?
I did not. I watched the black and white version.
Okay, because there are two versions. They restored the film reels and including like complementing it with Robert Israel's music, like decades and decades later, because this is one of those films that I think was almost lost forever,
Mm,
if I'm not
yeah.
mistaken. And the fact that you can watch it in color. The version I watched, like the opening montage, is like a lot of different like Technicolors just
Yeah.
the opening scenes, and then the rest of the film has like an amber tint that is
Hmm.
pretty distinct, and it's actually really cool. I would recommend checking that out as well, Sam, because I've seen
Interesting.
both versions, and I actually I do prefer the amber tint
Hmm.
because the detail is really good. The only downside is that it's a little bit more noticeable, all the makeup and stuff on Keaton's face.
Really?
um on also on the lawyer played by Snitz Edwards. Like
Yeah.
you could see the caked on makeup. It's kind of weird. But it's still really good.
I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah, that's funny. Come to think of it, as I recall during that opening montage, I did notice some different color tinting, but that's not something that necessarily warrants like having a color version. So I might actually have seen the color version and just not realized it. I wouldn't know. Whatever version is available for rent on Amazon Prime. Which, by the way, I found out that a lot of movies, a lot of silent movies, just because of how old they are, have sort of lapsed into the public domain, and so most of the
Yeah.
silent cinema, at least that still exists, and we'll talk about that in a second, is relatively easy to find. It's most of it is in the public domain, and you can watch it for free.
You can
Nosferatu
find
is
it
that
on
way.
you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah,
You can find it through, I think Criterion has Seven Chances. Kino International has a special edition DVD you can
yeah.
get of this. And I watched it on Amazon Prime Video. You can watch it through what the Cohen Media Group channel.
Oh, okay.
So there's a bunch of different avenues. It just depends on how you want to see it. If you want to see the original black and white or the color, I think both versions are available for free on YouTube. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's the best quality necessarily, but you can definitely access it that way.
yeah. Quality doesn't phase me as much, so I guess I wasn't paying attention to that. But yeah, and also the Internet Archive is a good website for films and TV that are in the public domain. So that is a good source as well. And yeah, we briefly mentioned this, but this movie was almost lost, and it was only because they just happened upon one of the original prints that was just laying around somewhere, and they were able to save it. But one of my college professors, Howie Mopshevitz, I should say, a very famous archivist, as a matter of fact. And if I wasn't just terrified of how important of a guy he is, I've actually thought about inviting him onto this podcast. But he had told me one time that about 90% at a minimum of all of silent cinema is lost forever, which is insane to think about. Just how
Yeah,
much
it's really sad.
how much still exists. To think that 10 times that once existed is really melancholy to think about. And it was just that's mostly just because of the way that silent movie was thought about. They weren't really giving a lot of mind to archiving film as an art form, like for posterity. They would sort of
Yeah,
just
like
produce it and they would use it and then they would just sort of discard it. Like it's frankly kind of amazing that as much has survived as it has with that.
think of it this way. So people listening, if you're like, I can't even fathom that. Like, why wouldn't people think of it the way that we handle memes? I know it's kind of silly, but
Yeah,
the idea of like people, even though people are sharing tons of these memes around, we don't think of them as culturally important, and we probably never will, right? But it's
yeah,
it's only like the really famous ones that really like survive, and
hmm,
then the rest just sort of disappear forever, you know. And it is a very different thing, but if you're curious like how that could possibly happen, that's like the same mentality as like you share a meme for a quick laugh. You don't think that it's going to be something that you want to remember for later.
yeah, yeah. That's a good way to think about it. I think just especially when it comes to just the sort of disposability that we kind of look at a lot of memes this way, and there's no reason not to. Like it's nothing that seems especially consequential, but yeah, I imagine there might be something along these lines that years from now we're going to think, man, where was that one meme I saw back in the year 2016?
Right.
I
Where's
guess
that
I'll never
Vine?
see it again.
There are
Yeah,
some Vines that I missed that were so fun, and I you
yes.
can't find them anymore.
Oh my gosh, I've had the exact same experience where I type in just the most bizarre keywords I could think of just to hope that it might possibly come up somehow. And
Right.
that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. So the fact
So
that
if it's hard even today for something like that with the resource of the internet, imagine, in
yeah,
the early 20th century, how difficult it would be to like save these copies or have them readily on hand. And all kinds of things happened over the years, like storms and fires, and
oh yeah,
these things were really delicate. And we're lucky we have what we have, and it's unfortunate what we don't have. But Seven Chances is something we do have, and that is very,
yes.
very fortunate for us.
It absolutely is something that we have. So the story goes apace, and as you mentioned, Buster Keaton just happens to be functionally betrothed to Mary. Like that's kind of the sense. Like that's kind of the vibe I get. And so he
They're
rushes home.
sweethearts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're sweethearts, and I think there's this really funny bit where the what I assume is like the executor of the will or whatever shows up at their firm, is trying to deliver the letter, and Buster Keaton and it's Meakin, right?
Meekin, yeah.
Yeah, Meakin and Shannon, they see that someone's delivering a letter. They're like, "Oh gosh, this
Oh,
isn't going to be
yeah,
good. What could it be?"
More bad news.
They try to flee the scene, and the guy is like chasing
Yeah.
after them. Gets to like a country club eventually, I
Oh, but
think.
before that, in the scene where they drive off in the car, I was thinking, it's like, that's how Will Ashton must feel. It's like you and I just get in the car, heading out to do an extra milestone, and Will Ashton's like, well, hey, I love Buster Keaton.
Oh
Then he
gosh,
steals a cab.
we love you, Will. Do not get any wrong ideas. But yeah, regardless, they eventually like the executive of the will literally has to unfold it and like press it against a window outside of the building where they're trying to flee from what they assume is some sort of financial charge. The guy gets escorted away from the police, and then they're like, "Hold on a second, there's no need for that kind of behavior around here." Like they're
Yeah, and
suddenly
it
gung
lingers
ho
on the
about it.
cop. Just the cop just like stares at them for a second, and
Yeah,
it's like he's disappointed he doesn't get to arrest somebody.
yeah. I mean, hey, maybe someday, but not today, as they say. And yeah, so they realize like, oh well, it's have to be married by 7 o'clock on your 27th birthday. Well, when's your 27th birthday? And because of course it is, it's today. And so
Yeah.
he's
Which,
got
by
to.
the way, I think like the idea of these guys being in financial ruin, it does make a lot of sense that they like skip out to go to a country club in the middle of a workday.
Of course,
And like, right?
wouldn't
And so
you?
like, I mean, if my law firm was on the brink of going under, I think I'd have better priorities. But all right.
There are a lot of weird plot contrivances in this movie that are kind of distracting, but also a lot of fun, especially when you know
Yeah.
just how disapproving Buster Keaton was of this story. You can kind of see why. It's like it's a bit of a dumb story. So I can see why Buster Keaton was not wholly enthusiastic. But the fact that he still brought his all to it and made it something quite enjoyable is impressive, to say the least. And so Buster Keaton goes back home and says to his wife, says, "Hey, want to get married?" And she's like,
You said you
"Oh,"
called it. No, she's not his wife.
or did I say
She's
wife?
just, yeah.
Okay,
So
I
they're
said that by
sweet. Like,
accident.
and we should say, like, the movie kind of opens with them as like he just can't express himself to her. Like he loves her and she loves him, but he doesn't know how to make it happen. Like he
Yeah.
doesn't know how. The only times he's able to express his emotions, because he's like stunted emotionally, is
Uh-huh.
when she's not there. And so like that
Yeah.
happens like multiple times in the movie, and it's played for laughs, and I think it's pretty funny.
Yeah, and that sort of like meekness and not being able to express himself. That's actually a common trope in a lot of Buster Keaton stories. A lot of them are kind of grounded in that sort of recognizable drama that we've all seen or experienced in one way or another. So that's certainly not out of place here. And that is the funny part where he's trying to like get up the gumption, like, all right, my heart exists only for you. No, that's bad. That's bad. Let's see.
Maybe
Let's see.
Mary might marry me.
Yeah, he's like rehearsing his speech that he's gonna give,
Yeah.
and what
Which
ends up
one of my
happening.
favorite little moments of his acting in the movie is just like all his shifting and like it's
Yeah.
so great. You don't need any title cards. Like we didn't mention this, but Keaton hated using two. He didn't like relying on title cards. I think most films of the era, even ones around the same length, would use over like 200 in one
Oh yeah.
movie, and he would keep it to 50 or below, something like in that range.
Yeah, let the story speak for itself. I like it, and it's very makes for really engaging movies because I find that as big of a fan of silent cinema as I am, the title cards do kind of like they can kind of amount really quickly. It's sort of the modern day equivalent of a movie just loaded with exposition because that's
Oh
really
yes.
what it is. Um, and so what happens is that yeah, he's doing all that shifting, which Buster Keaton just makes the funniest thing ever, and doesn't realize that she's there, and is practicing one of these lines, and then notices and like,
Classic.
oh hey Mary, hey, oh lovely day, huh? Like that's just the vibe I get from the scene, and gosh, I'm so bad at remembering plots. Is she like a little hesitant
Well,
about it? Is that what happens?
Well, yeah. So, and I do want to say one of my favorite things about watching silent films is I don't know if you like to do this, but I recommend doing this if you want a way to like interact a little bit. I love reading the title cards in funny voices. So like kind of what you said there of like, oh, that's the vibe I get. I love playing around with like the movie that way. Like unlike other films, one of the advantages with silent ones is there is like a bit of an interactive format. It's like reading a book where you get to put your imagination into it a little bit more and you get
Yeah,
to imagine what they're saying. And I don't know, like I think that was one of the things I love doing in these like silent film comedies when I was a little bit younger. And it's just fun. It's just good fun to do that. And in this scene in particular, it's so funny the way he like falls over his words because he's like, well, we have to get married today. And she's like, wait, why today? And he's like, well, I just have to marry somebody so I can get a bunch of money. And like, that's how it comes across. And
yeah,
she's just like, oh, he thought he just wanted to marry, like it could have been anybody. And like, she doesn't feel special. And it's funny because the movie does have like an arc. You do sort of understand by the end of the movie, not to give anything away yet, that there is a reason he wants this money and it's not purely for selfish reasons. And that
yes.
was something that I thought was like, I don't know, it was kind of really, I don't know, I thought it was nice.
No, it is nice. Yeah, it's good to see that these characters are very well meaning, even though they do indeed come across as being rather callous at times. Uh, and yeah, so basically, I love that idea, by the way, of adding silly voices because, as you and I'm sure a lot of listeners know, I am an impressionist, so I can imagine the fun times I'd had. Although I wouldn't recommend adding funny voices to, say, The Passion of Joan of Arc. I don't think that necessarily
Right. I don't think
warrants.
that quite works. Also, right after the scene, we should say blackface.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
what's
I
up with
almost
that?
forgot. Which is weird because there are actual African Americans in this movie.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, like the one character who actually does have some agency is in blackface.
Uh-huh.
And that's something you kind of have to roll with. I'm not the kind of person, I understand we've been dealing very recently. I feel like every time we do extra milestones, something else has happened with Gone with the Wind. It's like a
Yeah.
weird, like recurring theme. Um, but there is this like mentality that we have to sort of like erase movies in order to pretend like they didn't happen. I say no to that. Like,
Yeah.
let those movies exist and stay there so we can actually watch them and understand that's what life was like back then. They had
Yeah.
no problem with that sort of thing. And I think that it's one thing to celebrate the film for that, or it's to just sort of ignore it and dismiss it. It's another thing to appreciate the film on its own terms and start to think deeply about why was that acceptable back then, and like why was it so uncomfortable for them to even fathom like an African American, a black character in a movie being portrayed authentically, like the one character who has lines, for example. So just worth
Yeah.
thinking about. If you like historically, I think it's important.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely important. I think it's when it comes to not erasing these movies, I definitely concur wholeheartedly. Although I do think it is important, when appropriate, to establish context, to not just sort of present it in a vacuum without saying like, "Hey, so by the way, there's some messed up stuff in this movie." So that's like just keep that in mind and either take it or leave it totally understand either way. I think that is a valuable thing.
Right. And it's also valid to look at this film and criticize it for that reason, because it's jarring. It takes you out of it. It doesn't age very well. And it's, it doesn't take away from other aspects of this film that I think are timeless and wonderful. But, it's not a bad thing to be like, man, like, it kind of sucks that movies use this trope so readily back then. And clearly there was no sort of like cultural backlash to speak of as far as we know.
Yeah. Like there's like I just wish I could poke my head into the screen and be like, "Hey, no reason to do that. Just so you know, I'm from the future, but I don't need to be from the future to tell you that." So it's very distracting, and I was going to bring that up. And so it is something that if that's like if you draw a line there, then yeah, I totally get it. It's just a thing. And as much as we want to say it was a different time, certainly not acceptable for any time. But yeah, that is a thing. It's distracting, but I hate to just brush it off with like, what are you going to do? But that's kind of the point we're at right now, is just understanding that they just didn't get it.
Very true. Very true. And
Yeah.
speaking of not getting it, so he gets broken up with, and what I thought, like kind of rewatching this and trying to think of it a little bit more critically than I have before, it is a little weird that he doesn't even try to salvage the relationship as soon as she rejects him. He just pieces out.
That's what I was thinking. Like, just explain to her everything that happened. Say, listen, I love you very much. I don't necessarily want to marry you today, just like for no reason or whatever. But I need this money, and I'm sure both of us will benefit very heavily from this. Like that, like there, movie done. But because it's a comedy, that's not the way things work out. As a matter of fact, he has a foible. As everything, at nearly every turn, everything goes wrong. Something's misinterpreted, something doesn't go according to plan, or something just really effing weird happens. And that's when it's most enjoyable. Because what happens is that he goes to like what is it, like a saloon or something? Just sort of a social place of gathering where a lot of people
might be the country club again. I wasn't sure because the buildings look kind of similar, so it could be that, could maybe not. I'm not sure.
They look similar, and they've got a lady there, like, taking people's hats and taking care of them. So it seems like a country club kind of environment. So that's a reasonable assumption. They go there, they look out at the crowd, and it's either Meakin or the lawyer, I forget exactly who, says to James Shannon, Buster Keaton, "All right, how many of these women do you know?" He counts, he writes down their names. "I know 7 of them." He's like, "All right, you have 7 chances to find a bride in the next several hours." And so Buster Keaton, and I remember this being very amusing to me the first time as well as this time, goes through all of them really fast, like just blows his chance 7 times in a row. Now, not that it's an easy thing. They get really creative. Now, not that it's an easy thing to just out of the blue demand marriage and have it work out, but just
even in 1925 though, right, where I think that was a bit more acceptable, or it was like a little bit more like that could happen, or plausible, I should say, compared to today. But even so, like, these women laugh in his face, and it's just funny how like each situation is like there's a new like wrinkle, or there's a new twist on it. And like even my favorite one was when Meakin makes her think that he's the one who's proposing, and it's just like you see it coming. It's classic comedy, but it's still so satisfying when she looks over and he's like, "Oh, I'm proposing for him," and it's the lawyer giving the creepiest smile.
Yeah, which there's no reason to smile creepily either. Like you have no reason to be here. You're just hanging out. Why are you making eyes at this lady? So it's extra funny because of that. One of my favorites is when he sees one of them start to walk up this flight of stairs, follows her up the stairs. By the time they get to the top of the stairs, he's been rejected. And right at that moment, he sees another woman walking down the stairs, and he's like, "Let's go for it again."
Oh, well, he's in a hurry, see?
Yeah. The funniest one though, and this I almost, if I wasn't so pressed for time, I would have paused the movie because I was laughing so hard, is the hat check lady. The way that she's been, just like, you could tell she's been watching what Buster Keaton has been doing this whole time, wondering what the hell is this guy up to. And when he gets his hat back, like gives her a dime or whatever, and gives her this look, and she just shakes her head. No, it's not going to work out.
But even I really like right before that though, where like the baby, he doesn't give up right when he sees that she has a baby. He's just sort of like, yours. It's just like the timing of it. Like I gotta tell you, Sam, I think I laughed more during this movie than I don't think I've laughed this much during an Extra Milestone since probably Some Like It Hot. I mean, I think that's the case.
Yeah, and that's one of the funniest movies ever made. So that's certainly saying something. And in that scene, he's like, "Is that baby yours?" She's like, "Yes." And then I just love the way this question is worded.
You're going to raise it?
Are you interested in raising it? It is so funny, and it's so effortless in just the way that this zany situation, in especially given like just the amount of words, like, again, we mentioned the sparse use of title cards, and as a matter of fact, like past a certain point in this movie, it's almost entirely visual. Like there isn't a title card for quite some time in the climax of this movie. But yeah, so none of that works out. Buster Keaton decides, well, shoot, I know what I'll do. I'll take out an ad in the paper, because apparently that's all he could think to do at this point.
That's Meekin's plan.
That's Meekin's plan. Actually, no, we skipped a part, which is interesting to watch today. I was thinking of something differently. I was thinking of the part where he walks past what seems to be like some sort of a brothel or something like that. Sees a poster. Baths. Yeah, and goes in. He sees a poster with a woman on it. Goes in past this like shifty doorman, and right after Buster Keaton walks in, the doorman gets up and like moves something out of the way of the poster, and it turns out that it's and this is the exact wording from IMDb, so I apologize for this, but a female impersonator. So essentially, like a crossdresser, functionally, and walks out. It's different to watch today. I can see why it would be kind of funny, just that little reversal, but it seems like there might be a little bit of contempt during that way. And then right after that, in another moment, which is just extremely casually racist, and is just really hard to watch now.
Not even, it is explicitly anti-Semitic. It is extremely racist. Yeah. And we skipped over the part where he almost marries a girl who's implied to be like a young teenager, but he doesn't realize it.
Oh, really? I missed that. What happened?
Well, so you remember the girl who's like, "Oh, do you think anyone would marry me?" And he goes off with her. Then all the women who've rejected him kind of like laugh because her mother comes, grabs her, and puts a doll in her hand.
Oh, okay. So I totally missed the subtext of that scene. Yes, you're absolutely right.
So she's supposed to be like way too young, apparently. Like, and since back then you could get married at like 17, 16, she's probably even younger than that. So there's like clear pedophile, like not that he assumed. The movie doesn't really infer that like you think that he's a pedophile, but it's just sort of making light of that sort of thing. But then also, I mean, he runs into a woman who is Jewish, and then he immediately is like, well, I can't marry somebody who's Jewish, right? And it's like, I can't marry someone who's black. It's just like this very like explicit, product of its time. I guess I would say this is easily the weakest part of the whole movie, because it does that joke over and over again. It's really uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It definitely saves itself eventually, because you get to the stuff that's much more rewarding and satisfying. But you really have to sit through some annoying dated stuff here.
Yeah. And it's frustrating is the wrong word, but it's troubling because it's not like it really lingers on it in any way that implies hate. So it's impossible to tell like what their attitude is towards it, because it doesn't, in air quotes, seem hateful, but of course that may be the most insidious part of it all. So it's a lot of uncomfortable stuff that is just there. God damn it. Like what?
It is just sort of indicative. Yeah, it's indicative of like what was played for humor back then. Mm-hmm. And again, there is a time and place where we can acknowledge that and look at it and understand it and analyze it. We don't have to act like it's the end of the world, like it's some big surprise that people like had really racist views of romance in the 1910s. We know, right?
Yeah, we
Like there's no
know.
reason for us to play coy. It's just I think it's frustrating because it's like I want to enjoy this movie. Like just stop with this stuff. I don't like this stuff. Then we get to like what I think is the best part of this whole movie,
Yes.
which is the third act. The third act,
Yes.
one of my favorite third acts in any of the films of the silent era and beyond. It's just
Yeah.
absolutely pure cinematic wonder. Like
And
just scene after scene.
the fact that it's not even the best third act of Buster Keaton's career is
Yeah, that's true, I guess.
fantastic. Like any comedian or any I guess comedic movie star, whatever you want to call it, who pulled off this sequence or like the today's equivalent of the sequence, they
Yeah.
would be proud of that for the rest of their life. And the
He
fact
knew
that
how to
that's
end a movie. Mhm.
yeah, and as the story goes, this was what ultimately convinced him that the movie was worth doing, despite how just sort of thin and not really there the story was. But we'll get to that eventually. So what happens, as I mentioned earlier, is they do take an ad out of the paper. They're saying this man needs a bride. James Shannon falls heir to $7 million if married by the end of the day, and says any like what does it say? Any bride who shows up at this church at 7 will be our lucky winner tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the most unique wills ever filed for probate. Like I
Did it
wrote that
say that?
down.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
it did.
funny.
I think it's so hilarious too. The idea that they would be able to like Meekin would be able to within a couple of hours or so print a wanted ad
Yeah.
and enough people would see it. Like where did he get the photo?
I mean,
Like,
well, I assume they have a photo of James
oh,
Shannon at the ready.
sure.
No,
But
that's not an unreasonable thing to assume. They're a law
why would
firm. They probably have that.
Okay, all right, fair enough, fair enough. I
Yeah.
do want to say, by the way, I mentioned Thomas Roy Barnes who plays Meekin. I did want to say I've been like curious about this too. So I haven't seen him in a lot of movies, but it does dawn on me that he was often known as T. Roy Barnes, which is Troy Barnes. So is that where Dan Harmon got the idea for Donald Glover's character in Community, or is that just a huge coincidence?
It's very possible. There are a lot of cultural references that just come from the weirdest places you would never assume. So that is entirely within the realm of possibility.
I mean, I follow Dan Harmon on a lot of things. I guess I've never really caught whether or not he's a big fan of Buster Keaton. I assume he probably is because who isn't? But yeah,
Right.
that's a dangling thread I'm going to put out there.
Very interesting. Yes, if anyone happens to know, John would very much like to find out. So, yeah, they take an ad out in the paper. Buster Keaton is waiting at the church, this completely empty church, and it's been a long day. He's been through a lot. He doesn't know what his immediate future is going to look like. You can tell he's very tired. So he lays down on the church pew and goes to sleep. At that very moment, it starts with 1, and then it increases to like 5, and just one by one, hundreds of women in bridal gowns start filing into the church. and eventually the entire place is packed. One of them comes in, sits down next to Buster Keaton, which kind of wakes him up a little bit. He's like, oh, hey, a bride's here. Very nice. Another one comes down, sits on the other side. Oh, there's 2 of them. Oh, goodness. I'm
Which,
going to
by
have
the
to.
way, she's wearing a wedding ring for some reason. So
Oh, I didn't notice that. That's funny.
I did. I was like, wait a minute,
I mean,
you cheater.
listen, there's a cynical way to look at it, that it was the mention of money that got them all there.
I think that's what it is.
It's not an unreasonable thing. But yeah, he realizes like, oh, there's 2 of them here. I'm gonna have to choose between them, and then turns around and sees just a sea of brides awaiting his selection. And I like to think that in this moment, Buster Keaton thinks he's in some sort of bizarre dream right now. Like, he doesn't think this is real. He thinks,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I am having the weirdest dream right now. And then, for whatever reason, or I guess it kind of makes sense, just flees the scene. Like the priest comes out, sees all these brides, and is like, yeah, I'm not doing that. You figure that out.
Right. Well, Yeah, I think they realize they get the idea that it was a practical joke and that he did all of this to fool them.
Uh,
And it's a really good dramatic irony because he goes from nobody will marry him to too many people will marry him.
yeah. And what begins is this frantic chase that's about, like, what is it, like 15, 20 minutes long. So it's a third of the
I think
movie.
about
So
20 minutes.
about
Yeah,
20
it's
minute long
long.
chase through this city, and which is just one of the funniest things. Now, we should mention one thing that sets it off is that the Mary is her name, right?
Yeah,
His beloved.
he's got to marry Mary.
He's got to marry Mary, and the way he finds that out is because Mary's friend, or maybe her mom or her sister or something, I didn't catch the exact relationship, convinces her uh, to give James Shannon a second chance, to say, like, listen, this is a insanely bizarre situation. I think you should rethink this. And so she does, and so sends a letter by way of her servant, who is, as we mentioned before, the character of blackface, which is just frustrating, again, that that's even a thing, but it is what happens. And so sends him to James Shannon, and it takes a while, but eventually he gets the letter and realizes, Christ, I've got to get back home. I've got to get married to Mary, And what begins is this huge chase, and it goes through the city streets, like into the wild. One of my favorite bits is that Buster Keaton is walking home, and it's this long shot where we're looking at him walking down the street, and then we see way in the background a huge crowd come in, and we know, oh, that's an angry mob of brides. And it takes him a long time to realize it. And just waiting for the moment of realization is like 80% of the fun. Just waiting for the moment when Buster Keaton turns around and sees a swarm of wedding gown clad women just sprinting his way. And then
Yeah,
when he
it's an
gets
even
chased.
more Yeah, it's an even more ambitious version of Cops, his short film, where it's like the same concept, but like not as many people. But you really see the difference when like first of all, they're like throwing bricks at him,
Yeah.
and like there's even people in the back of the crowd throwing bricks at like each other. Like clearly, like the
Oh,
bricks are not
really?
going to reach him, ladies. Like, but even like
Gosh.
one of my favorite shots in the whole thing, it's a little bit earlier, is when they go through the football field,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like absolute pandemonium. And just when you think it's over and you're watching this and it's hilarious, the punchline really is all the stretchers coming out
Yeah.
for the war. It's like it's just such comedy. Like we're going on and on about this movie, but like, people, if you have not seen Seven Chances and you're still listening to this, first of all, interesting. Second of
Yes.
all, go watch this movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Relatively easy to find. It's a short watch. It's 57 minutes. It's a hell of a time, in spite of some incredibly poorly aged parts that we've touched on before.
Yeah.
Those are in
You
there.
see the
Those are
difference.
obnoxious. But yeah,
You see
that's,
the difference between this and like its modern successor, which like they tried to make a movie with the same sort of concept with the brides chasing in the 1999 film The Bachelor. Did you ever see The Bachelor, Sam?
I did not actually, no.
Well, it came out the year you were born, so I understand. It's Chris O'Donnell, and I
Weird
saw this
thing, but
movie
okay.
when I was. Yeah, but it's like it's the same concept. Like clearly, it's like trying to riff off of it, and it's not even
Yeah.
close to as good as Seven Chan. Like it is unbelievably weak by comparison. And a lot of that is the way that Buster Keaton is so good at running.
Yeah.
It's like anybody, whenever I hear people say like Tom Cruise is good at running in movies, I'm like, get out of here. You haven't
Yeah.
seen. I don't need.
There,
He's maybe a quarter or a fraction of Buster Keaton when it comes to running.
Yeah, I concur entirely. There are a few things that Buster Keaton is very specifically good at. One, falling down. Look at the way Buster Keaton falls
Oh
down,
yeah.
and just his entire body goes completely limp, and he never lands on one spot for more than like a nanosecond. He always does all this rolling around and eventually somehow inexplicably lands on his feet again. And it's really just fantastic to see. There's one scene a little bit later in Seven Chances where he tumbles down a cliff, and the way he like just like front flips down the cliff basically is one of the funniest things I think I've ever seen. It is
It's like a triple
completely
somersault.
it's a
It's
triple
real.
somersault down a hill. It's crazy. And that's before the boulders. And yeah, what one thing I wanted to mention really quickly is the scene with the bricks you mentioned. The funniest part that you didn't even mention is that they're getting the bricks from a building under construction. There's literally a carpenter there laying bricks down, and they're coming by and taking off the bricks that he's just mortared to each other, to the point where the crowd, the swarm passes by, and the wall that the guy was working on is completely gone. And you get the sense that he's just makes this exclamation like, why does this happen to me every time? I can't believe it. It's just funny to project, personality out of these characters when they only get a moment on screen. But yeah, so Buster Keaton knows, I've got to get home. I know, I'll take a shortcut through, like, what is it, like a wheat field or something, and
also a train yard,
a train.
and it gets lifted by a crane. It's like we could be here all day just going
Yeah,
through just it's like set piece after set piece, and some of it was done through reshoots, because the boulder scene you mentioned,
yeah,
they originally, that wasn't part of the script, but they were showing it because some like rocks accidentally fell down and looked like they were hitting him. It like generated a ton of laughs. They decided to go back and shoot like that whole boulder scene, and that's a big
yeah.
reason why the boulder scene goes on and on. It's because clearly they wanted to get their money's worth, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe they were trying to stretch it out to a little bit longer of a movie, but what we may
It's
never know.
effective.
One funny thing I also love is there's one part where he tries to like hail a cab or something to get back home, gets in the car, and then immediately jumps out, and we realize there was one of the one of the gypped
Yeah.
brides already in that car, so he can't go
Yeah.
anywhere
He holds
without.
on to a tire of a car that like speeds off, which is funny because there's another movie he's in. I forget which one it was, but he tries to do that, but then the car goes off without him because the wheel wasn't really part of the car. Do you remember that movie? I
Oh,
can't remember which one that was.
I remember seeing the set piece. I can't remember which one it's specifically
Yeah,
from.
I can't remember either. He like turns around a sign that says vulcanizing.
Yeah, yeah,
Ridiculous. But in this movie, he actually does it. But then there's a literal car crash, and
yeah,
like the cut is so fast. But like we didn't get a chance to mention this earlier, but one thing I really love about silent movies as well is that the camera speeds up and slows down to match both the music and the visual comedy. So you
mm,
always get like exactly what I think the director planned for the comedic timing, which just makes it even funnier. Is because you
yeah,
know you're in the hands of somebody whose comedic timing is better than yours.
yeah,
And so like that scene in particular is like right when it like cuts and he falls. It's like
yeah,
it's so ridiculous, but like I don't, it's like even little mistakes like when he's on the tree and it breaks, right?
yeah, yeah.
Like it's technically a pretty noticeable cut.
It's
But
really noticeable.
you know, you could forgive it pretty easily because like he gets up so fast that it's just like I don't
Yeah.
know. It plays into the energy and the frantic mania of the movie, so I don't think it's a flaw necessarily.
Yeah, and there's never a down moment in this climax either. One of the in that car crash you just mentioned, he's hanging onto the back of onto the back of the car. The car hits another car, and the camera cuts, and we realize they're running into like a cable car or a streetcar or something, full of brides that have hijacked the cable car, and they all start
They are
swarming out and chasing after the
they
guy.
are they are so mad at this guy. It
They're
is
so
absolutely.
they're so devoted. I almost wonder what happens to them because we never really find out. I guess they're
We know
still
that they're not.
trying to find
Yeah,
Buster Keaton.
we know
So
they're not pure
that's
evil
funny.
because at one point they think they killed him because they orchestrated the crane pulling him to drop him where a train just went, and then they all start crying. But then they see him
Yeah,
and start running after him again.
they just
So
want to
yeah, it's
know
just
what
sort of
they just want to
yeah.
know what the hell's going on. Why did you ask us to come here, and why are you now fleeing from all of us frantically? I can imagine they'd be a little bit confused and wanting to understand what happens. But yeah, we got to wind down here. But this boulder scene, which if there's anything that this movie is very specifically iconic for, it's this boulder scene where Buster Keaton takes a tumble down a cliff, hits some little pebbles that get dislodged from wherever they are, and start rolling down the hill. They hit some bigger rocks, and it devolves into a full-scale rock slide that like is knocking over trees and stuff and God knows what else kind of damage. And it's very clear, you mentioned that this was reshot afterwards. It's very clear that they just made a bunch of huge paper mache boulders. They do not,
Yeah.
they look really out of place with the landscape, but that almost makes it even funnier to think that just the universe is against I almost said Michael Keaton, against Buster Keaton at this point, and will do anything to just conjure boulders out of thin air just for the purpose that they will be able to roll down this hill after
Yeah.
him. Like
Well,
nature itself is fighting back.
we should mention that he actually disliked this movie, but he really liked that scene. I think it's of his opinion that it's because of this scene that he actually thinks the movie is salvaged. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And he almost ended it like around that point. Like originally, the ending was just going to be him running away, and like we never get a resolution.
Yeah, which would almost be funnier. But I like the resolution they ultimately have, which is he gets to the house. It's been a day. Gets to the house. They're ready to get married. Mary's completely gung ho about it, and they look at. Buster Keaton looks at his watch and realizes, I'm too late. It's after 7. And by the way, I just want to bring up, I know there's not an answer for this. Who's enforcing this stipulation? Like, what does it matter if it's 7:01? Like, where, like, are they gonna? I just wonder how this actually is being implemented. This stipulation.
I think we're working on the honor systems.
You know. They are lawyers, so I would imagine. I guess it makes sense that they would want to be true to their word when it comes to getting $7 million or not.
Well,
but regardless,
his lawyer is a lawyer, but I think it's a brokerage firm, to be specific.
Did I say lawyer? I meant to say brokerage firm. Yeah. And yeah, so they're completely despondent, and there's this moment where they might have to accept, like, listen, we tried, we went through a lot, but maybe we're just gonna have to do without the money. And then Buster Keaton remembers, wait a second, my watch is broken. It's not actually 7 o'clock. Sees a clock tower way off in the distance. I wonder how the watch was broken to make it say a later time, but that's a detail. It doesn't matter.
They play into it a bit, right? Where he goes to the watchman's shop and everything, and clearly he's just like unlucky with time itself. But I think it's worth pointing out that we sort of learn like what his real motivations are in this scene, why he wants the money so badly. And it's not because he wants to be rich. He seems plays into why he has trouble expressing himself to Mary. It's because he thinks he doesn't deserve her. And the movie is sort of saying like, it's not that he wants to marry her and he's out of time. It's that without the money, he doesn't think that he can provide for her. He doesn't want to marry her, be with somebody just to dump all of his problems on her. Yeah. So that plays into why he's so despondent about it. And you can sort of look at that and be like, well, the midsection of the movie, he's just doing it to save the firm. The only reason he decides that he needs to do the marriage thing at all, because he just wants to be with Mary, is for his best friend, his partner, who's like, we need this money. It's going to say, so he does it for somebody else. And I think that's what makes this movie kind of work, is they always find a way to tie it back to, he does have pure motivations, and you can sort of like worry about the movie really believing that at certain times, but I think this ending is what saves that. And real quick, I'll say the thing I do love about this movie that I think is timeless is that it is a wonderful metaphor for just the anxiety of marriage and how it feels. Like you feel like there's a deadline to get married at a certain time in your life. Back then, 27 was pretty old to get married. And there's this like dichotomy of like, you know, you try the person you really want to be with. There's a misunderstanding and it doesn't work out. And then you go from person to person and everything, nothing works. And then like, it's just sort of like a funny thing, but then all of a sudden everybody wants to, it's just that anxiety of like marriage just being such a joke unless it's with the right person. That's what I think lands with this movie. That's where I think like some people don't give Buster Keaton enough credit for understanding or infusing, like there is real heart in his comedies. It's just not the focal point. And you sort of have to like really pay attention to get it. It's not like, you know, it's not in your face about it, which I appreciate. I think that it is there for you to find if you want that in your movie.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I hadn't really thought about that. I think I mentioned to you already. My favorite Buster Keaton movie is Steamboat Bill Jr. from 1928. That movie is hilarious. It's iconic, but at its heart, it's a movie about a son trying to live up to his father, and I think that's what's really at the heart of it. That's what's driving the whole thing, and so it makes all the comedy around it. It sort of infuses it with meaning. Whereas I think if you want to compare to someone like Charlie Chaplin kind of starts with the meaning and then just sort of extrapolates the comedy from there. I think Buster Keaton works in the opposite procedure. So I think that's the reason why a lot of people will say that Buster Keaton is funnier than Charlie Chaplin, which he is. Uh, Although
But Chaplin,
not as outwardly melodramatic, you know.
exactly. Chaplin is more likely to move you, right?
Yes.
Like he's more likely to bring a crowd to some sort of like narrative catharsis or to make them rethink something or like he's not like it's not that he's a deep thinker necessarily. It's just it's the melodrama. I think that is the right word. He's just so good at. And that's just not part of what Keaton does. It's not his style and it's great that we have both comedic actor directors because that is sort of what makes them special in their own right.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlie Chaplin is okay with going for long periods of time without having any visual humor, and I think that makes for a lot of strong stories. But Buster Keaton also knows the value of having a good laugh, and I think Seven Chances has quite a few of them. Wouldn't you say?
I think that is the case. I think it
Yeah.
is. And I think I do you think I'm curious what you think about this. What I think that there are two movies that he did that he also wrote, and
Mhm.
a lot of people credit them as the best ones he did, and that's Go West and The General. So, would you say that this film, do you think that part of the reason it's not quite at the level, at least for a lot of people, is because he didn't write it? Or do you think that it's other things? Like this movie's screenplay is like a bunch of people. I forget off the top of my head, but people he had collaborated with before and everything. But like you did mention that like it seems at some points like his heart's not really in the narrative.
Yeah.
But do you think that it's just different when it comes to The General, which tends to be people's favorites? Because you do really like Steamboat Bill, which is also, fantastic. But I don't think he wrote that either, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I
So,
think that might certainly be part
fair.
of it. Just not as much passion. Of course, it helps that we know all the behind the scenes objections that Buster Keaton may have had. Uh,
He did co-direct. I think one of the screenwriters for Seven Chances was the co-director and maybe co-writer of The General. So who knows? It's so
hmm,
gray back then. No
yeah,
pun intended. Whatever.
yeah. It's it. The point is that it's what we have, and it's quite good. Again, with reservations, which we mentioned. Uh, but this is something really special. And if you're looking for an introduction to silent cinema, as we mentioned before, this and really any other Buster Keaton movie, again of varying qualities, not a bad place to start at all. Again, we mentioned some of our favorites. There are plenty others. Even if you even want to start with some of the shorts, those are good too. I recommend One Week. That is one of the funniest concepts for a comedic short ever, as well as many
Oh, that's the
others.
one where he's the groom, right?
That's one where he's the groom, and they have a house kit, and they try to build it,
Yeah.
and it goes really badly, but it all works out in the end. Not unlike Seven Chances, so I think that's a good one to start with as well.
It's like because I remember the build it yourself houses from yeah. People who've played the game Red Dead Redemption 2. I remember playing that game. There was a whole thing in that where you build a house. And I remember thinking of Buster Keaton, but I couldn't remember which thing it was. And I guess it was this short film, huh?
Yeah, it was One Week is the title. So check
Fantastic.
that one out. I'm sure it's very easy to find. John, I've had a good time talking about
Yeah.
Seven Chances. It was good to get back to the silent era. I think we covered a lot of ground here, and I look forward to covering even more ground in the future.
Oh my
Perhaps a
gosh.
bit
There's
more
so much.
dramatic. The day may come when we get to one of the
Oh
really
yes.
heavy silent melodramas
A
that we can really dig
melodramatic,
into.
like Yeah, like a silent romance would be a ton of fun. I
Hmm.
have a lot of favorites for those. There's a lot of actresses to take it into consideration who really define this era.
Yep.
So that's got to come up eventually, and I think the new expansion of the show will help bring that about sooner than it probably would have otherwise.
Yes.
So when's the next extra milestone coming out, Sam?
John, I will tell you the next extra milestone, if all goes according to plan, knock on wood, because apparently that's a thing. Next week, a week from now, uh, it will be myself and veteran of Anyway, That's All I Got, Jason Reed. We were going to
What?
be
Jason?
reuniting Jason
Jason
Reed.
of the Jason movies, Jason?
the, Not quite, but I like where your head is at. No, this is my good friend Jason, who did Anyway, That's All I Got with myself and Anthony Battaglia for quite some time back in 2018. We're going to be reuniting, and we are going to be talking about a very fascinating triple feature that I cannot wait to dive into. We're going to be talking about Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless. We're going to be talking about Georges Franju's Eyes Without a Face, which we almost talked about several months ago,
Yeah.
but it was also eligible for a different for the month of March as well. So we're going to be talking about that, and Dario Argento's Deep Red, which I have not seen and I'm looking forward to. So by all means, if you want to check those movies out before next week, or if you just want to go in blind, we won't be diving headlong into the plot for all three of those. But by all means, feel free to watch along with us. We're going to have a lot of fun. I can't wait for that episode. And then the week after that, you and I, and presumably Will Ashton, are going to be talking about Rebecca, Alfred Hitchcock's Best Picture winning Rebecca, and Jacques Becker's prison movie Le Trou, which I dearly
Oh,
love.
yes, can't
So
wait.
we got a lot on our plate.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I've triple milestone. It's gonna be big. But if anyone can do it, I think it's you and Jason.
I think so too. Jason's really looking forward to doing it again, as am I. John, thank you for joining me to talk about Seven Chances. Thank you for helping fill this gap. Again, I mean, I could have gotten anyone really, but
Very true.
I'm glad
But
that
hey,
you were the one.
I had to cancel. I was going to go to this church. Apparently, I was going to be able to marry this person for $7 million, but I decided to help you out instead, Sam. So you're welcome.
It's like the third next best thing. So I think it could have gone a lot worse. But I'm glad that we had this time nonetheless. And I say we sign off until the next extra milestone. From the Internet, Colorado, I'm Sam Noland.
From the Internet, California, I'm John Negroni.
And we'll see you next time.